Early 1945. The Pacific Ocean stretched endlessly from the Marianas to the waters near Japan's home islands. Across this vast expanse, the U.S. Navy moved with a power the world had never seen before. 24 Essex-class carriers steamed forward, their decks loaded with hundreds of planes. These were not scattered across different theaters. They sailed together in coordinated task forces, prepared to strike at Iwo Jima, Okinawa, and beyond. It was the final phase of the Pacific War, and the United States had brought its full industrial strength to bear. In Tokyo, Japanese naval leaders gathered in dimly lit rooms, poring over intelligence reports. Scouts and radio intercepts told a story they could not believe. 24 fleet carriers. Not escort carriers, not old converted ships, but modern, purpose-built Essex-class carriers. The admirals questioned the numbers. Some believed it was a mistake or an attempt at deception. They remembered Pearl Harbor, when they had been the ones to wield the power of carriers. They remembered Midway, when 4 of their best ships went down in flames. Since then, they had struggled to rebuild. Now, faced with these reports, the scale seemed impossible. The Essex-class carriers were the product of a wartime building program that had no equal. Each carrier displaced over 27,000 tons and could carry nearly 100 aircraft. They had armored decks, modern radar, and strong anti-aircraft defenses. Crews trained continuously, learning to launch and recover aircraft with precision. The ships were designed for long voyages across the Pacific, with the range and speed needed to strike deep into enemy territory. They steamed at over 30 knots, fast enough to outrun threats and keep pace with the fast battleships and cruisers that screened them. Japan could not match this. By 1945, only a handful of Japanese fleet carriers were still operational, and many were damaged or barely seaworthy. Fuel shortages kept them tied to port. Their air groups were small and filled with inexperienced pilots. The training program that had once produced elite aviators like those at Pearl Harbor had collapsed under the weight of losses. American submarines and bombers sank tankers and supply ships, cutting off vital resources. Every sortie drained precious fuel and aircraft that could never be replaced. At sea, the difference was stark. In February 1945, as the U.S. prepared to invade Iwo Jima, task forces launched strikes that stretched across hundreds of miles. Waves of fighters and bombers lifted off from the Essex-class carriers at dawn. They hit airfields, shipping lanes, and defensive positions on island after island. From above, the sky filled with American planes, so many that Japanese defenders struggled to track them all. Pilots reported seeing dozens of carriers on the horizon, their wakes cutting through the ocean like white scars. Japanese scouts sent back urgent messages. The reports piled up. More carriers, more destroyers, more cruisers. In Tokyo, silence fell as the numbers were read aloud. 24 fleet carriers, operating together. Some admirals sat in stunned disbelief. They had expected the Americans to be powerful, but not limitless. A few years earlier, Japan had been the leading carrier power in the world. Now, they faced an enemy with more modern carriers than they had planes to fill their decks. The room filled with quiet acknowledgement that they were facing an enemy whose resources far outstripped their own. The tactical reality at sea was unforgiving. American carriers launched strikes in coordinated waves, hitting multiple targets at once. When one group of aircraft returned to refuel and rearm, another was already in the air. Japanese defenses could not keep up. Anti-aircraft guns fired until their barrels overheated, but the swarms kept coming. Kamikaze pilots were sent out in desperate attacks, diving into American ships with explosive charges. Even then, the sheer number of carriers meant losses could be absorbed. A damaged ship could be replaced by another from the long line of Essex-class carriers built in American shipyards. For the men aboard those carriers, the scale of the fleet was both awe-inspiring and routine. Pilots looked out from their cockpits and saw the ocean covered with friendly ships, a sight that gave them confidence before missions. Flight deck crews worked in shifts around the clock, moving planes, loading bombs, and fueling aircraft. Discipline and coordination kept the pace relentless. There was no single dramatic moment of decision. Instead, it was a steady, unending pressure applied to the enemy day after day. On the Japanese side, despair set in. Admiral Toyota and his staff understood what these numbers meant. Each Essex-class carrier represented not just a ship, but an entire system of logistics and training that Japan could not hope to match. They had already committed to special attack units, the kamikaze, as a way to strike back with limited resources. Now, faced with overwhelming American power, these desperate tactics became their only option. Even so, they knew it would not be enough. The invasion of Iwo Jima began under this shadow. As Marines stormed the beaches, American carriers maintained constant air cover. Fighters swept ahead of bombers, striking at any Japanese position that fired back. Japanese aircraft tried to interfere but were cut down before they reached the fleet. The battle raged for weeks, but the outcome was never in doubt. Offshore, the carriers kept launching, their decks never silent. The sheer scale of the American carrier presence marked a turning point in the Pacific War. Japanese intelligence officers reported back to Tokyo with growing resignation. The dream of a decisive naval battle, once the centerpiece of Japanese strategy, was gone. There was no single fleet engagement left to win or lose. The Americans had too many ships, too many planes, too many men. Each new report confirmed the same grim truth. The Imperial Navy had been surpassed, not just in strength but in its very ability to wage modern war. The Essex-class carriers were unlike anything the world had seen before. Built to fight across the vast distances of the Pacific, they were large, powerful, and designed for constant action. Each ship displaced more than 27,000 tons under standard load. And when fully supplied with fuel, planes, ammunition, and crew, the weight rose past 36,000 tons. Their decks stretched long and wide, giving enough space for nearly 100 aircraft to operate at once. This included fighters for protection, dive bombers for precision strikes, and torpedo bombers for sinking enemy ships. Every part of the design served a single purpose: to keep planes flying without pause. Speed mattered as much as size. The Essex-class could make 33 knots, fast enough to keep pace with cruisers and battleships that formed the carrier groups. That speed gave them flexibility. They could strike an island in the morning, withdraw to safety by nightfall, and be ready to launch again at dawn. The carriers were supported by destroyers and cruisers armed with radar-guided guns, but the Essexes had their own layers of defense. They carried modern anti-aircraft weapons, including 5-inch dual-purpose guns and rapid-firing Bofors cannons. This firepower gave them a fighting chance against enemy bombers and, later, kamikaze attacks. Radar towers scanned the sky, guiding combat air patrols to intercept threats before they reached the fleet. The design also focused on efficiency. Flight decks were built for quick turnaround. Planes could be refueled, rearmed, and launched again in minutes. Elevators moved aircraft between hangar decks and flight decks with speed and reliability. Every inch of space was planned with care. These features allowed continuous waves of strikes to roll out across the ocean, something no other navy could match at the time. On an Essex-class carrier, operations never stopped. Even at night, crews worked under dim red lights, readying planes for the next mission. While the United States surged ahead, Japan struggled to maintain even a fraction of its former strength. At the start of the war, the Imperial Navy had been the most powerful carrier force in the world. That advantage ended at Midway in June 1942, when 4 frontline Japanese carriers were destroyed. The losses in both ships and experienced pilots were crippling. Over the next 2 years, American submarines cut Japanese supply lines. Tankers sank and fuel became scarce. Even when ships were repaired, there was often no fuel to send them to sea. By early 1945, Japan had fewer than 4 operational fleet carriers. Many of these were outdated or damaged. Some were used as decoys, stripped of planes, their decks empty except for a few training aircraft. The situation for Japanese air crews was even worse. Before the war, pilots went through a long, rigorous training program. They were among the best aviators in the world. As the war dragged on and casualties mounted, that system broke down. Training was shortened, and inexperienced pilots were rushed into combat. By the time of the battles for the Philippines and Okinawa, most Japanese pilots had only a handful of flight hours before facing American veterans. The result was predictable. In every major engagement, Japanese planes were shot down in large numbers, and replacements could not keep up with losses. The Essex-class carriers represented more than just a single ship design. They were proof of America's industrial system at work. Shipyards on both coasts and along the Gulf of Mexico built them at a pace no other nation could match. Steel arrived by rail, prefabricated sections were assembled, and workers labored around the clock. It became routine to launch a new Essex-class carrier about once a month. At one point, multiple carriers were under construction at different stages, some being launched while others were still being fitted out with equipment. This was assembly line warfare brought to the scale of an ocean-going fleet. The sheer numbers told the story. By 1945, 24 of these carriers were at sea in the Pacific, each surrounded by escort ships and supply vessels. Behind them was an even larger network of support. Oilers refueled them at sea. Ammunition ships delivered bombs and shells. Hospital ships took in the wounded. This floating system allowed the carriers to stay on station for weeks or months at a time without returning to port. It gave the United States an advantage no enemy could hope to overcome. In contrast, Japanese shipyards were bombed regularly by B-29s and lacked the resources to build replacements quickly. The materials needed for construction, steel, fuel, aluminum, were all in short supply. Even if Japan had been able to build new carriers, they had no pilots to fly from them and no fuel to power them. The imbalance was total. By the time the Americans prepared for the assault on Iwo Jima, the Japanese fleet was a shadow of its former self. The difference could be seen in the makeup of each side's forces. The Japanese carriers were few in number and often carried fewer than 30 planes each. Many of those planes were outdated models, slower and more fragile than the American fighters they faced. Meanwhile, each Essex-class deck was crowded with the latest aircraft: Hellcat fighters, Avenger torpedo bombers, and Corsair strike planes. The American planes had better radios, better armor, and better weapons. They flew longer distances and returned to carriers that could repair and relaunch them within hours. The American system did not depend on luck or individual brilliance. It relied on processes, training, and logistics. Pilots rotated through flight schools that produced thousands of aviators each year. Mechanics and deck crews trained in specialized programs to keep operations smooth. Supply chains extended across the Pacific, linking islands and bases in a vast web. Every piece fit into the larger whole with the carriers at the center. By early 1945, this system reached its peak. The presence of 24 Essex-class carriers operating together showed what the United States had achieved. It was not only a fleet but an entire mobile air force at sea, able to project power across thousands of miles. Japan's remaining ships and aircraft were scattered, weak, and often immobilized by lack of fuel. The Imperial Navy could no longer challenge the Americans directly. The Essex-class carriers became the symbols of that overwhelming strength, a sign that the balance of power in the Pacific had shifted for good. In the opening months of 1945, the Pacific became a stage for the largest carrier operations in history. The U.S. Navy had gathered its strength into fast-moving task forces, each built around several Essex-class carriers. These groups stretched across the horizon, hundreds of escort vessels protecting them as they advanced. The target was not one island, but many. The Americans struck the Marianas, the Philippines, and Formosa at the same time. Their goal was to keep the Japanese off balance, to prevent them from concentrating what little strength they had left. Every day, before dawn, flight decks came alive as crews rolled out planes, fueled them, and armed them for another day of strikes. Japanese scouts, flying long-range reconnaissance missions, searched desperately for signs of the enemy. One morning, a scout reported spotting several large carriers moving toward the Ryukyu Islands. The officer receiving the report thought it was a mistake. A handful of carriers, perhaps, but nothing that could alter the balance of the war. Then more reports arrived, each describing more carriers, more cruisers, more destroyers. Radio operators intercepted American communications that hinted at a massive buildup. By the end of the day, the truth was undeniable. The United States had not sent a few carriers. They had sent 24. These were not escort carriers or converted passenger ships. They were modern fleet carriers, each with close to 100 aircraft on board. The Japanese commanders stared at the figures in silence. Some muttered disbelief, others questioned the reliability of the intelligence. But as the reports continued, even the most skeptical among them realized what they were facing. At sea, the Japanese pilots who flew over these American formations saw the scale for themselves. From their cockpits, the ocean seemed covered with ships. Columns of gray hulls stretched to the horizon. Carriers steamed in the center, their decks swarming with planes. Battleships and cruisers formed protective rings around them, while destroyers darted along the edges like guard dogs. Pilots later described the sight as overwhelming. Even before combat began, they knew they were outnumbered and outmatched. Operation Iceberg, the preparation for the invasion of Okinawa, showed the full coordination of this vast force. American carriers launched wave after wave of strikes. Some hit airfields on nearby islands, others attacked shipping lanes and coastal defenses. The timing was precise. As one group of aircraft returned to refuel and rearm, another was already on its way to the target. The sea itself became an extension of the battlefield. Fueling ships, ammunition ships, and repair vessels moved constantly to keep the carriers supplied. Japanese forces tried to respond. From bases on Kyushu and Formosa, fighters scrambled to intercept incoming raids. Many were shot down before they reached their targets. Those that broke through faced tight formations of American fighters ready to defend the carriers. Anti-aircraft guns on cruisers and destroyers filled the sky with bursts of black smoke. Pilots on both sides fought dogfights over the ocean, twisting and diving between tracer rounds. On the decks of Japanese carriers, chaos ruled. Crews rushed to prepare planes for last-ditch attacks. Mechanics worked under constant strain, with limited fuel and ammunition. Commanders issued orders to launch as many aircraft as possible, knowing most would not return. As losses mounted, a new strategy emerged: the use of kamikaze pilots. These special attack units were ordered to dive directly into American ships, turning their planes into guided bombs. It was a desperate measure, born from the realization that conventional tactics no longer worked. The first kamikaze waves struck hard. Destroyers and escort carriers were hit, some sunk outright. For a moment, Japanese commanders hoped these attacks might slow the American advance. But the sheer number of U.S. carriers meant they could absorb damage and keep fighting. When one carrier was hit, another took its place in the formation. Flight operations continued without pause. Radio intercepts revealed the growing panic within Japanese ranks. Messages crackled with urgency and confusion. Some pilots reported enemy formations so large they could not count the ships. Others gave conflicting positions, unable to track multiple task forces at once. Commanders struggled to piece together a clear picture of the battle. The Americans seemed to be everywhere at once, striking from multiple directions, never giving their enemy time to regroup. In one encounter, a Japanese pilot flying a reconnaissance mission returned to base visibly shaken. He reported seeing carrier decks so crowded with planes that they seemed like floating airfields. He described fighters launching in rapid succession, one after another, while bombers waited in neat rows for their turn. His words painted a picture of industrial warfare on a scale that Japan could not match. As the invasion of Okinawa drew closer, the pressure intensified. American carriers blanketed the area with air patrols. Bombers struck inland targets day and night. Japanese bases became ruins, craters replacing runways, hangars reduced to twisted metal. The few planes that managed to take off did so from makeshift strips, often without proper repairs. The final battles at sea were marked by relentless action. Japanese pilots dove into carrier groups, sometimes breaking through, sometimes cut down before they reached their targets. American sailors fought fires on their decks, pushed damaged planes overboard, and kept operations going. The cycle of attack and defense never stopped. For the men aboard the carriers, time blurred into a constant state of readiness. There was no safe harbor, only the endless sea and the next mission. From the Japanese perspective, each day brought a clearer picture of their predicament. The enemy's numbers were not exaggerated. 24 carriers truly sailed together, each one a floating city of war. The Imperial Navy, once proud and dominant, now faced annihilation. Kamikaze pilots were briefed on their missions with solemn words, knowing they were being sent to their deaths. Even the highest-ranking officers began to accept that they were no longer fighting for victory, but for delay. The American strategy worked as intended. By striking across multiple islands at once, they forced the Japanese to divide their limited forces. No single base could be reinforced in time. The attacks came too fast from too many directions. This was modern carrier warfare at its peak. A contest decided not just by tactics but by production, logistics, and relentless pressure. As the sun set on those long days, the ocean bore the marks of the struggle. Burning ships drifted aimlessly, their crews rescued or lost. The wake of the carrier groups stretched behind them for miles. Overhead, the last planes of the day returned to their decks, guided by signal lights through the darkening sky. The Americans prepared for the next strike, while the Japanese faced the grim reality of another day with fewer planes, fewer pilots, and fewer options. The reports arrived slowly at first, a handful of scout plane sightings and intercepted signals. Japanese commanders dismissed them as exaggerated or mistaken. No enemy fleet could be that large. Then came photographs, radio transcripts, and first-hand accounts from pilots who had barely escaped American patrols. The truth became impossible to deny. 24 fleet carriers, each with nearly 100 aircraft, were advancing toward Japan's defensive line. The numbers staggered even the most experienced admirals. In the operations room, Admiral Somu Toyota listened in silence as the intelligence officers read their reports. The walls were covered in maps of the Western Pacific, covered with colored pins marking known American positions. One officer placed a cluster of new pins near Okinawa, then another near the Marianas, then more along the approaches to Formosa. Toyota leaned forward, his expression unreadable. Finally, he spoke, his voice low and even. "We are fighting a giant with endless resources," he said. "Every ship we sink is replaced. Every pilot we kill is replaced. We cannot fight this war forever." The men around him shifted uneasily. They had all believed in the strategy of a decisive battle, a single clash that would turn the tide as Tsushima had in 1905. Now that dream seemed hollow. The Imperial Navy had only a few carriers left, many without full air groups. Fuel was rationed to the point where ships could not even leave port without weeks of preparation. They faced an enemy whose carriers appeared to be everywhere at once. Admiral Agaki, a longtime naval officer, later wrote in his diary about the moment he realized Japan could not win. He described the American buildup as a wall of steel and fire that grows taller each day. He did not share this openly with his men, but it colored every decision he made. In private, he admitted to friends that they were no longer fighting to win, only to delay the inevitable and protect the homeland for as long as possible. For the Japanese crews on the front lines, the scale of the American fleet was crushing. Pilots took off knowing they would not have enough fuel to return. Mechanics worked with broken tools and scavenged parts. Sleep came in snatches, interrupted by alarms and urgent orders. Many of these men were teenagers, rushed through abbreviated training programs and sent to the front with only a few hours of flight time. Some were told they would be flying special attack missions, the kamikaze, before they even touched the controls of their planes. They bowed to their commanders, wrote farewell letters, and climbed into cockpits stripped of armor and parachutes. One young pilot, in a letter discovered after the war, wrote simply, "I am not afraid of death. I am afraid of failing my country." His plane never returned from its mission. His words mirrored the feelings of thousands of others sent on similar flights. Their commanders watched them take off and vanish into the distance, knowing that the sacrifice would change little against such overwhelming numbers. On the American side, the mood was very different, though no less intense. For many young sailors, the sight of 24 Essex-class carriers steaming together was unforgettable. A pilot named Jack Arnold described his first day at sea aboard the USS Bunker Hill. "I walked out on deck at sunrise," he wrote, "and all I could see were ships, Carriers, battleships, destroyers, supply vessels, stretching to the horizon. It was like the whole ocean belonged to us. This display of power inspired confidence, but it also carried a heavy weight. Everyone knew that combat lay ahead, and that even the mightiest fleet could be vulnerable. Before major battles like Leyte Gulf and Okinawa, the ready rooms were filled with nervous energy. Pilots checked and rechecked their gear, listening to final briefings delivered in clipped, steady voices. Some joked to hide their fear, while others sat in silence. Once the launch order came, routine took over. Planes roared down the decks and into the air, leaving the rest of the crew to wait and hope for their return. American sailors kept diaries too, and their words reveal a mixture of awe and exhaustion. A crewman aboard the USS Essex wrote during the Okinawa campaign, "We have been at general quarters for 3 days. Planes come back damaged. Some don't come back at all. The work never stops. We just keep going." For him and many others, the war became a cycle of action and reaction. Victories counted in missions completed and comrades lost. The human cost was evident on both sides. Japanese crews fought with courage but little hope. Their ships were poorly supplied, their airfields cratered by constant bombardment. Each night, they counted fewer planes and fewer pilots. The American crews faced their own trials. Kamikaze attacks struck without warning, sending men scrambling to fight fires and save their ships. Even with replacements ready, every loss was felt deeply. Sailors carried the memories of those moments long after the battle ended. When Japanese pilots dove toward the American fleet, they saw decks crowded with planes, crews moving with practiced precision. Some were filled with rage, others with resignation. American gunners aimed and fired, knowing that hesitation meant death. The clash was personal and immediate, yet shaped by forces far beyond the individuals involved. Factories, shipyards, training schools, and supply lines determined the outcome more than any single act of bravery. Admiral Toyota met with his staff again as Okinawa fell under siege. The reports were even worse than before. American carriers launched strikes day and night, without pause. His officers spoke of reserves that no longer existed, of fuel stocks that had run dry. Toyota listened, then stood and addressed them. "Our men fight with everything they have," he said, "but we cannot give them what they need. The enemy can. That is why they advance, and we retreat." Far out at sea, young American sailors stood on the decks of their carriers, watching the sun set behind a fleet so vast it seemed to merge with the horizon. They felt pride and sorrow in equal measure, knowing that tomorrow the planes would launch again, and somewhere ahead, men just like them would try to stop them, knowing they could not. The destruction of the Japanese fleet at Leyte Gulf in October 1944 marked the end of Japan's ability to fight a traditional naval war. Before this battle, Japanese leaders still believed they might turn the tide with one decisive strike, as they had at Pearl Harbor. Their plan was to lure the U.S. carriers into a trap, using what remained of their fleet in a series of coordinated attacks. It was a gamble born of desperation, and it failed completely. When the fighting ended, for Japanese carriers, 3 battleships and 10 cruisers were sunk. Thousands of sailors were lost. More than ships had gone down. The Imperial Navy's last real hope for offensive action disappeared beneath the waves. From that moment, the Japanese High Command faced a grim reality. They no longer had the strength to meet the Americans in open battle. Only a handful of carriers survived, and most of these had no aircraft to operate. The few planes Japan still possessed were scattered across bases that were under constant attack. Fuel shortages kept many ships tied to their piers. Japanese admirals understood that victory was now impossible. They spoke of defending the homeland, but in private, many admitted the war was lost. With conventional tactics no longer viable, Japan turned to a new and desperate strategy. The kamikaze program began late in 1944, after the defeat at Leyte Gulf. Young pilots were trained for one-way missions, their planes loaded with explosives. They were ordered to crash into American ships at full speed, sacrificing themselves to inflict damage. It was a strategy of last resort, meant to slow the U.S. advance and buy time for Japan to prepare its defenses. Commanders did not expect it to win the war, only to delay the inevitable. For the sailors and pilots who carried out these attacks, the missions were both terrifying and certain. They were given short ceremonies, often writing final letters to their families before being sent out. Some believed in the cause and accepted their fate willingly. Others followed orders quietly, hiding their fear. Their sacrifice was immense, but the effect on the American fleet was limited. A single kamikaze could damage or even sink a destroyer or escort carrier, but the Essex-class carriers were far harder to kill. With dozens of these large ships at sea, the U.S. Navy absorbed the blows and continued its advance. While Japan's naval power collapsed, the Allies gained unmatched operational freedom. The sheer number of Essex-class carriers allowed American commanders to conduct multiple large-scale operations at once. One task force could support landings in the Philippines while another struck Formosa, and still another prepared for the assault on Iwo Jima. No other navy in history had operated on such a scale. Each carrier group brought with it hundreds of aircraft, screening ships, and logistical support. This meant that even if one group suffered losses, the overall force remained strong. The control of the sea gave the United States the ability to cut Japanese supply lines. Isolated garrisons on islands across the Pacific were left without food, ammunition, or reinforcements. American submarines added to this pressure, sinking tankers and transports that tried to move between Japan and its outposts. As a result, many Japanese units were trapped, unable to influence the larger war. Entire island garrisons were bypassed and left to wither on their own, their fate sealed by starvation and disease rather than direct combat. The mobility of the carriers also allowed the U.S. to strike deep into Japanese territory with little warning. Airfields, factories, and ports came under constant bombardment. Japanese commanders never knew where the next blow would fall. With radar and secure communications, American forces could coordinate attacks across thousands of miles. This flexibility made it impossible for Japan to mass its remaining strength in any one place. Every time they attempted to reinforce an area, another strike would land somewhere else, forcing them to divide their limited resources. As preparations began for the invasion of Okinawa, this strategy reached its peak. 24 Essex-class carriers, supported by a vast fleet of battleships, cruisers, destroyers, and supply vessels, moved into position. The Japanese defenders faced an enemy that seemed to multiply every day. Even when they inflicted damage with kamikaze attacks, the American fleet pressed forward. Every loss was replaced quickly. The continuous flow of ships from U.S. shipyards ensured there was never a shortage of carriers or planes. The contrast between the two sides could not have been more stark. Japan's fleet was broken and scattered, with no ability to launch a coordinated attack. Their remaining aircraft were flown by inexperienced pilots, many with only a few hours of training. In contrast, American pilots were well-trained and well-supplied, supported by experienced deck crews and advanced maintenance facilities. The difference was visible in every engagement. When Japanese aircraft attacked, they often did so piecemeal with no coordination. American defenders cut them down with radar-guided guns and disciplined fighter patrols. When American aircraft struck back, they did so in overwhelming numbers with precise timing and massive firepower. By the spring of 1945, the U.S. Navy had complete control of the seas around Japan. This dominance gave planners the confidence to move ahead with Operation Downfall, the planned invasion of the Japanese home islands. Although the invasion would ultimately be cancelled after the atomic bombings and Japan's surrender, the preparations alone showed the scale of American power. The Essex-class carriers would have been the centerpiece of that operation, providing air cover for the landings and striking inland targets relentlessly. For Japan, Leyte Gulf was the turning point not just militarily but psychologically. After that battle, even the most optimistic leaders understood that the Imperial Navy would never rise again as an effective force. Meetings at naval headquarters took on a somber tone. Commanders spoke of sacrifice and defense, not victory. Kamikaze units became symbols of a nation fighting to the last, but they were also a clear sign of strategic defeat. Without carriers, without fuel, and without experienced crews, Japan had no path back to parity with the United States. American commanders recognized this shift. With the Japanese fleet neutralized, they could plan operations without fear of a sudden counterattack. They no longer had to keep their forces concentrated for defense. Instead, they spread out, hitting multiple targets at once. This operational freedom shortened the war and hastened Japan's collapse. In practical terms, it meant the Americans could dictate the pace of events, striking when and where they chose while Japan could only react. The Battle of Leyte Gulf was the moment when the balance of power in the Pacific finally and irrevocably changed. Afterward, the ocean belonged to the United States. Every island, every shipping lane, and every approach to Japan's homeland lay under American control. The Essex-class carriers symbolized that dominance, their decks crowded with aircraft, their task forces stretching to the horizon. For the Japanese Navy, there would be no recovery, only a slow and inevitable decline as the war moved ever closer to Japan itself. When the war ended, the Essex-class carriers did not fade into history. They remained at the heart of the U.S. Navy for decades. At the moment of Japan's surrender, these ships were scattered across the Pacific, their decks crowded with aircraft and their crews exhausted but victorious. In the months that followed, they brought troops home, ferried supplies, and stood as symbols of America's new global presence. For many sailors, the war ended aboard the same ships on which they had fought. Planes were stored or scrapped, weapons unloaded, and the decks that had launched thousands of combat missions were cleared for peacetime duties. The Essex-class carriers were built for a specific war, but their design proved adaptable. As jet aircraft began to replace propeller-driven planes, many of these carriers were modernized. Their flight decks were strengthened and angled to handle the faster, heavier jets of the post-war era. Elevators were upgraded, catapults were improved, and new radar systems were added. These changes kept the ships relevant through the 1950s and 1960s. Some served in Korea, where they launched jet fighters and bombers in support of ground forces. Others later took part in operations during the Vietnam War, showing that a design born in the early 1940s still had value in conflicts far removed from its original purpose. By the height of the Cold War, the Essex-class carriers were no longer the most advanced ships in the fleet, but they remained vital. They filled roles that larger, newer supercarriers could not. Some became anti-submarine warfare carriers, focused on tracking Soviet submarines across the Atlantic and Pacific. Others were converted to helicopter carriers, transporting troops and equipment for amphibious assaults. Their flexibility was a testament to the strength of their original design. Even when newer carriers like the Forrestal and Enterprise classes entered service, the Essex-class ships continued to serve alongside them. The long service life of these carriers demonstrated the power of American industrial planning. During the war, shipyards had launched them at a pace unmatched by any other nation. After the war, the sheer number of surviving ships gave the United States a depth of naval strength that no rival could match. This advantage shaped the early decades of the Cold War. The U.S. Navy could project power across the globe, showing potential adversaries that it could strike anywhere, anytime. The legacy of the Essex-class was not only in their wartime achievements but in the strategic reach they provided for a generation afterward. For historians, the story of the Essex-class carriers also highlights a turning point in naval warfare. Before World War II, battleships had been the measure of a nation's strength at sea. Their heavy guns and thick armor were symbols of dominance. The Pacific War ended that era. The ability of carriers to project air power across hundreds of miles changed everything. At Leyte Gulf and Okinawa, carriers determined the course of battle, while battleships shifted to supporting roles. After the war, every major navy recognized that the carrier was now the core of any fleet. The battleship, once king of the seas, was relegated to history. The Japanese experience served as a stark lesson. They had built excellent carriers before the war and trained some of the world's best pilots. Their early victories at Pearl Harbor and in the opening months of 1942 showed the potential of carrier warfare. But Japan lacked the industrial base to sustain the fight. Once their initial forces were lost, they could not replace them at the same rate. The United States, by contrast, built one Essex-class carrier after another, turning shipbuilding into a system as efficient as any factory. This imbalance decided the outcome long before the final battles were fought. Admiral Toyoda's remark during those desperate final months, "We are fighting a giant with endless resources," was not an exaggeration. Captured the reality of modern war. Success depended not only on strategy and bravery but on production, logistics, and the ability to keep forces supplied and ready. The Essex-class carriers were the physical embodiment of that idea. Each one represented thousands of workers, miles of supply lines, and the combined effort of an entire nation focused on a single goal. For the Americans who served aboard them, the end of the war brought mixed feelings. Some ships that had seen the fiercest battles were quickly decommissioned and placed in reserve fleets. Others were refitted and sent out again under new banners and missions. Crews who had once launched attacks on Japanese islands now found themselves sailing into ports as symbols of stability. Many of these men wrote about the strange contrast between wartime urgency and peacetime routine. Their carriers, once engines of destruction, became platforms for diplomacy, training, and deterrence. The sight of 24 carriers at sea in 1945 was never repeated, but it remained a defining image. It marked the peak of U.S. wartime mobilization, when factories, shipyards, and training programs all reached maximum output. This moment showed what a modern industrial democracy could achieve when fully committed to war. For the Japanese who faced that overwhelming force, disbelief turned to grim acceptance. Reports of the American buildup were once dismissed as exaggeration, but when the carriers appeared in numbers too great to deny, the shock was profound. Even after the war, Japanese naval officers wrote about their astonishment at the scale of the American effort. As the years passed, some Essex-class carriers were scrapped, their steel recycled into new ships or civilian projects. Others were preserved as museums, silent witnesses to the events they had shaped. Visitors walking their decks today can still see the outlines of the spaces where pilots once prepared for missions and crews once fought to keep their ships afloat under attack. These preserved ships offer a tangible link to the era when carrier warfare redefined the seas. The legacy of the Essex-class carriers is found not only in their long service but in the lessons they taught. They proved that control of the sea in the modern age depends on the ability to project air power. They demonstrated that production and logistics are as vital as tactics and courage. They showed that a navy's true strength lies not in a few mighty ships, but in the steady, relentless flow of replacements and reinforcements. Above all, they stand as evidence of how the course of history can turn on the combined efforts of millions of ordinary people building something extraordinary.